Hello everyone, welcome back. We are at Purgatorio 16, which is the 50th canto of the Divine Comedy. Believe it or not, it's what in Italian I would call il giro di boa, which means the turn around the buoy. You know, when you're paddling or swimming and you get to that buoy and then you come back. This is the 50th canto of the Divine Comedy, so the 50th video that I've uploaded in this crazy series of mine. And so great opportunity as always to thank everybody who's been supporting this channel with your comments, with your interest, your passion for Dante, your passion for the Divine Comedy, that has enriched the experience of reading it for me massively. The only thing that is more joyful than reading the Divine Comedy for me is reading it with some other people, with a group of readers who also love it and like to discuss about it. So thank you very much again for that. Canto 16 of Purgatorio is also specifically important because it's so central, and as we've been saying from the beginning, Dante cared a lot about geometry, architecture, when it came to his Divine Comedy in particular. So he reserved Canto 16 of Purgatorio for the key of his entire work, which in fact and interestingly he presents in line 74-75, which is the exact center of the canto and therefore the exact center of the entire work, of the entire Divine Comedy. This concept is in fact free will or the concept of human freedom. This short video is going to be only scratching the surface for sure. In fact, it would be useful to read Convivio, the fourth book of Convivio, or at least a portion before reading this canto to properly understand it. So I will include that part in the description of the video. So if you want, you can take a look at it before listening to the video and before reading the canto. So we know how central vision was for Dante. The most repeated word in the entire Divine Comedy is sguardo, everything that has to do with viewing, looking, the eyes. So that was the most important sense for him. And in Canto 16, vision is completely taken away from Dante and from the souls of Purgatorio. Not from Virgil, who is somehow able to still guide Dante throughout this very thick smoke that covers the entire canto. Let's remember, everything that happens in this canto happens in a thick cloud of smoke, so Dante can't see anything, he can only hear. And Canto 15, we remember that ended after Dante saw these three beautiful visions with a little bit of this black smoke that was already arriving towards them. And now they are completely covered, so that the beginning of the canto is very strong. Also from a musical point of view, from a poetic point of view, is very strong with buio d'inferno e di notte privata. It's already dark, it's already very dark. There is nothing as dark and rough textured as this type of smoke. My eyes could not endure remaining open, so that my faithful, knowledgeable escort drew closer. As on the other terraces, the first thing that Dante hears is a prayer. In this case, the prayer chosen for this particular canto and terrace is the Agnus Dei or Lamb of God, which is a perfect choice from Dante because the prayer in itself goes, Lamb of God, who take away the sins of the world, have mercy on us, reiterated a couple of times, and then the third time, in the third iteration, the prayer goes, grant us peace. The fact that the prayer concludes with peace has a lot to do with the opposite, the polar opposite of wrath, of anger, which is the sin that is punished here. Peace, as we said, meekness, gentleness, and peace are all part of that core of virtues that are contrasting and opposing wrath. At a certain point, a third voice comes from the darkness, saying, then who are you, whose body pierces through our smoke, who speak of us exactly like a man who uses months to measure time. This is the voice of Marco Lombardi. We're going to find out his name later, but Marco Lombardi is a historic character who lived in Lombardia, and not much is known about him. So there's not a lot of historical background. We think that he was a courtly person, so very well educated, and Dante considered him to be a man who was very virtuous, particularly virtuous and attached to values, with a certain maybe intransigence that Dante can reflect himself into. On verse 31, Dante is already foreshadowing the main theme of the canto, when in speaking to this soul, he says, O creature, who that you return fair unto him who made you, cleanse yourself. You shall hear wonders if you follow me. He promises a reward to the soul if the soul helps Dante and Virgil find the right way. And at the same time, in Italian, he says, per tornar bella a colui che ti fece, to go back beautiful to him who made you. And this desire to go back to God is really behind the main theme of this canto. So Dante says, I began, with those same swaddling bands that death unwinds, I take my upward path. It's interesting he mentions this swaddling bands because it's correct. In Italian, Dante calls them this fascia, and he's referring to the body, the human body. But the metaphor that he's using, or the simile that he's using, is fascia, which is the swaddling band or the protective cloth that in which infants were wrapped. I noticed Dante does this a lot. He anticipates some type of visual theme that he's going to use later in a canto, in the beginning of the canto. He will talk in Canto 16 about an infant, about a little baby again, and here there is already a little bit of a foreshadowing of that image. Also, the fact that Dante uses this image to call the body, this protective cloth for a baby, it's perfect. It's a perfect utilization of language to give us the impression of how important the soul, the human soul, is compared to the body. The body is really almost not important as a protective bandage. What really matters is our soul, which is the baby inside this fascia. Since God so gathered me into his grace that he would have me, in a manner most unusual for moderns, see his court, meaning heaven. Do not conceal from me who you once were before your death, and tell me if I go straight to the pass. I find the most interesting portion here of this passage is where Dante says, in a manner most unusual for moderns, because it's not a casual comment about his journey. This is a clear reference to the fact that in modernity, he's the only one to embark in this type of journey, for the importance of the journey and for how we can compare it to the journey of St. Paul, as we saw in the very first chapters of Inferno, where Dante says, I am not Paul, I am not Aeneas. He compared himself to St. Paul back then. So St. Paul was the one who did the journey in antiquity, but in modernity, under Dante's vision, he has a certain exceptional investiture from God to be allowed to do this particular journey. So we get to what we can call the trigger for the long reasoning that we're going to read in this canto, which is a sentence by Marco. Marco Lombardi says, I was a Lombard and I was called Marco. I love those goods for which the bows of all men now grow slack. He is a courtly man. Even the fact that he's using a martial metaphor also means that he's a courtly man. But this fact that he mentions that the contemporary values, the contemporary virtues being decadent is a double trigger for Dante, because Dante says here, before my doubt was simple, but your statement has doubled it and made me sure that I am right to couple your words with and others. So he's actually referring here to Guido del Duca in Canto 14. So the double doubt of Dante is a doubt generated by the words of the respected people, the respected men. One is Guido del Duca and the other one is Marco Lombardi. And the words say more or less the same thing, because if we go back to Canto 14 to read the two lines that Dante is referring to here, Guido said to him, "Virtue is seen as serpent, and all flee from it as if it were an enemy, either because the sight is ill-starred or their evil custom goads them so." Both Marco and Guido are talking about the dissolution of the current time, the current powerful people and politicians, the lack of values and morals in his contemporary world. And now, to follow what this long reasoning that starts here, which is full of St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, biblical references, philosophical references, etc. And so it's really, really dense. One way to simplify it, at least in our mind, at least that helped me, is to divide it in three main parts. The first one, where Dante talks about free will, it's really Marco Lombardi speaking. The second one, where the reasoning talks about the creation of the human soul and how the human soul has a specific desire. And the third one, where Dante talks about the two sons, the theory of the two sons, that we already touched on in my videos. At least I talked about it in Canto 6 of Purgatorio. We could say that Dante uses Marco Lombardi's mouth to explain his ethical and political vision. As I mentioned, all of these concepts had already been written by Dante in his CONVIVIO, but he's versifying them, and in a beautiful way, of course. The ethical vision, we could say that is closest to the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas. The political vision is closest to the writings of St. Augustine. In fact, there's going to be a lot of echoes of the City of God, or Civitates Dei, by St. Augustine. So what is this doubt that is exploding in Dante's heart? Why is he addressing Marco with such impatience? Dante says, "The world indeed has been stripped utterly of every virtue. As you say to me, it cloaks and is cloaked by perversity. Please explain to me, so that I can also tell other people when I come back from this journey, if the cause of this perversity and malitia in the world is, like somebody says, due to celestial influence, or like somebody else says, the Christian doctrine is here in ourselves on earth." So this needs to be unpacked a little bit, because Dante is talking about something that is specific to his time, but at the same time he's touching something that is absolutely universal and that has to do with us today as well. Specifically to his time, he's talking about a certain determinism that in his time was promoted and supported by many, especially when it came to looking at people's lives through astrology and the actual influence of planets and stars on people's lives. Many people believe that. The Christian doctrine had been opposing this type of theories strongly, and of course Dante has been siding with the Christian doctrine. So Dante's question is really about his present time. He's asking, why is the world so corrupt? After having been speaking for the entire Divine Comedy about corruption in Tuscany, corruption in Romagna, corruption in Lombardy, etc., etc. But we can see easily how this question can be also interpreted and read as what is the cause of evil in the world? What causes malice, evil, the corruption of our world, basically? And that's where this piece takes its huge universal importance and heavyweight position in the Divine Comedy, because Dante is talking to us about freedom, he's talking to us about free will, and he's talking to us about the cause of evil. What is causing evil? These are huge questions. So we shouldn't really think about Dante's question as limited to his times, meaning only astrology versus the human Christian view. When he refers to astrology and the influence, the celestial influence, we should, I think, read it in our times as any type of external determining factor that influences our life and in one way or the other limits our moral choice. In other words, there are many factors that are external of us. That could be class, privilege, type of upbringing, education, etc., 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 that are outside of us. And if we look at them as in Dante's time, they were looking at the celestial influence, we look at them as from a position that is completely safe because we are not responsible. So it really comes down to responsibility. If there are things external of us that put constraints on our free moral agency, then we are not worried too much about blaming ourselves because they are external. And this is an attitude, an approach that somebody might say that is even more common in today's society than back in Dante's times, because we see it every day. So it's a very, very contemporary issue that Dante is touching on here. In a very dramatic way, Marco, the first thing he says is "ui," which is an exclamation of pain, and it's an exclamation of pain and frustration almost to see how blind all human beings are, including Dante, in even not understanding the answer to this question that Dante is asking. He says "ui," and he calls him brother, frate. Frate is a way that Dante was called by Oderisi as well, by Sapia, by many Purgatorio characters, to highlight the friendly love that the Purgatorio souls have with each other and for Dante. The world is blind, and you come from the world. You living ones continue to assign to heaven every cause, as if it were the necessary source of every motion. If this were so, then your free will would be destroyed, and there would be no equity in joy for doing good, in grief for evil. This is all St. Thomas Aquinas. And the way Dante presents this type of concept is by negating the contrary. Demonstratio ab absurdum, where presenting the contrary and then negating it. If this were so, then our free will would not exist, would be destroyed. Therefore, the cause of all these problems cannot be found in the celestial influence. And again, here Dante is following almost word by word St. Thomas Aquinas, where he says, the heavens set your appetites in motion, the movements of your soul. Not all of your appetites, but even if that were the case, even if they were all the movement of your soul, you still have received both light, which is your reason, the reason, on good and evil, and free will, which, though it struggle in its first wars with the heavens, then conquers all if it has been well nurtured. There's so much to say here, because of course it's Aquinas, arguably the greatest Christian theologian who ever lived. This point about nurturing free will, we have this free will, which again, this is really the middle, the center of the entire canto, which it struggles first in wars with the heavens and then conquers all if it has been well nurtured. This is a concept that is also fairly countercultural. The fact that very often when thinking about religion, we hear a stereotype by which religion is a comfort, something that has been invented to comfort people. I'm not understanding something or I'm missing something, therefore I find refuge in religion. The reason why this is completely wrong is that I don't care if, and you shouldn't care, if some religious people think that's true, because it's not. If religion is applied, not only Christianity, but Islam, all the serious ancient monotheistic religions applied seriously with profundity and honesty, religion is everything but comfort. It's training, it's effort, it's a constant journey and constant work. If you are feeling like your religion, in inverted commas, is simply giving you a little candy of comfort, then that's not what, for Christianity, Jesus Christ ever talked about. There is a good habit that needs to go into it. There is work that needs to go into it, and that Dante refers to as se ben si nutrica, or if it has been well nurtured. On greater power and a better nature, you, who are free, depend, that force engenders the mind in you outside the heaven's sway. Thus, if the present world has gone astray, which is the trigger for Dante, in you is the cause, in you it's to be sought. I love how this is replicated by Mandelbaum from Dante's Italian. In voi è la cagione. In fact, Dante says voi, which means you guys, you in the plural, voi. And he repeats it. In voi è la cagione, in voi si cheggia. In you is the cause, in you is to be sought. This is the answer. It's your responsibility, it's my responsibility. So the free will monologue of Marco, it's almost as if it culminated in this paradox, which is liberi soggiacete, at verse 80. Liberi soggiacete. It means free, you are submitting yourselves. And that Mandelbaum translates as you who are free depend. Liberi soggiacete. What a difficult to accept concept this is for our modernity. How can I be free if I'm submitted to somebody? I once heard a celebrity or an actor saying, I don't believe in God because I would never believe in somebody who asks me to go on my knees and beg him in order to get something. I'm getting the things that I want in my life because I'm free to get them. And this concept of freedom is very, very modern in terms of our days, but is rotten, in my opinion. Okay, I'm giving my free personal opinion unasked for, but it's completely rotten and mistaken. I'm with Dante when it comes to a concept and a definition of freedom, which is a freedom that accepts the submission to God. And here I'm going back to something that Father Paul Pearson in my interview in a separate video told me, which is whenever you're reading a spiritual text and you find something that is really nourishing, stop and ponder on it. Now, what could be more nourishing or even more important than this concept? What Dante is talking about here, there's nothing more fundamental. He's basically saying, in your life, in my life, it doesn't matter the cards that I've been dealt in this poker game, which is my life, or card game that is my life. It doesn't matter which cards I get. It's all about how I'm going to play the cards that I've received. Starting with verse 85, we have what I consider to be the most beautiful part of this canto. Beautiful poetically and beautiful from a metaphorical standpoint. It's Dante describing the birth and evolution of our soul, of our human soul, as a baby, as a child. And again, this is following what he had already written in Il Convivio years before. So it would make sense at this point if I try to read a small portion from his pages of Convivio after we look at this couple of terces. So Dante says, Marco Lombardi says, issuing from his hands, the soul on which he thought with love before creating it is like a child who weeps and laughs in sport. It's completely depending on its instinct. The soul is simple, unaware, but since a joyful maker gave it motion, it turns willingly to things that bring delight. At first, it savors trivial goods. This would beguile the soul, and it runs after them, unless there's guide or rein to rule its love. Mandelbaum says trivial goods. At first, the soul savors trivial goods. And I don't want to criticize Mandelbaum's translation here, but literally, Dante says piccol bene. Piccol bene means little goods. So the size of the goods is of utmost importance here, because in Il Convivio, Dante gives us a spectacular description of the progression of our desire. Our desire, let's remember desiderio, the word desiderio coming from absence of the stars. Our desire being born and then growing and growing and growing exponentially. So here is what Dante wrote in Il Convivio years before. He says, because the soul's knowledge in the very beginning is imperfect, goods that are little look very big to the soul. An example could be the breast of a mother. The breast of a mother can be everything, can be completing a little baby's desire, and therefore almost can be God for a baby, right? And therefore, the soul starts with this type of goods. The soul starts to desire this type of goods. And this is why we see it's such a beautiful part here. It's almost poetic, even if it's in the essay format. In Convivio, Book 4, Chapter 12. Therefore, we see little kids desire in a utmost intensity an apple, un pomo. And then, as they progress and as they grow a little bit older, they desire a little bird. And this makes me smile, because a little bird, I don't understand why. Maybe it was such a coveted little pet for middle ages kids. A little bird. And then beyond this, they will desire a nice piece of clothing, and then a horse, and then a woman, and then wealth, but not very big, some wealth, but then a bigger wealth, and then even bigger, and riches. And this happens because none of these things that the soul is that is seeking, is actually what the soul is looking for, because the main desire of everything, of every soul, is the desire to go back from where it comes from, which is God. Another way to explain this is to envision this progressive expansion of the soul desire as a cone, where when it's very little, it's only desiring little things and imagining them as really big. And then it's expanding to the clothing, the horse, today the car, the house, the career, the job, etc. But none of these things have the attributes to satisfy our human desire. Why? Because of the concept that we are made in the image of God. We have the divine in ourselves as human beings. Therefore, there is only something endless that can satisfy our desire, and that's God. This is what St. Augustine said, is probably his most famous quote, where he said, God, you have made us in your image, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. The only thing that can appease our existential anxiety is God. Therefore, one needed law to serve as curb. A ruler too was needed, at least one who could discern at least the tower of the true city. Dante here is quoting literally the Civitas Dei of St. Augustine, the city, and the tower represents justice. So he's asking here, through Marco of course, he's asking for a ruler, a guide, who at least is able to see what true justice is, this tower. In other words, the possibility of mistake is innate in the soul, and therefore comes the necessity of a guide, the necessity of a political rule, and also of a moral rule. And here comes this allegoric couple of tercets from verse 97 to 102, where Dante says, the laws exist, but who applies them now? No one. The shepherd who precedes his flock can chew the cud, but does not have cleft hooves. Now, is obviously referring to his contemporary situation, political situation, that he has described before already, and he is describing an Italian peninsula where the political power of the emperor has diminished, if not completely absent, and by default the church has taken the temporal power. So this is producing a lot of dysfunctions. The shepherd who precedes his flock, who can chew the cud but does not have cleft hooves, this is a biblical allegory that Dante takes from the Bible, and that refers to the Pope. The reference is to the concept of purity for an animal that in ancient times for Jewish people was considered an animal that was pure and therefore eatable. In order to be pure, an animal would need to have at least two attributes. One, the cleft hoof, and two, it would need to be an animal that chews, or in the sense of rumination. For example, the camel has rumination but doesn't have the cleft hooves, was not considered pure, and the pork, the pig, was not considered pure for the opposite reason. It has the cleft hoof but it actually doesn't ruminate. So in this type of ethical projection into the political world, this has been compared to priests who meditate on the scriptures, and this is the rumination. And also the skill of discerning between good and evil, the two main things, and that's the cleft hoof in two parts. The point being, the Pope, who is now in charge in Italy, doesn't have all these characteristics of purity, and therefore is not the right person. Misrule, you see, has caused the world to be malevolent. The cause is clearly not celestial forces. They do not corrupt. This misrule, translated by Mandelbaum, is actually bad behavior, because Dante says mala condotta, bad behavior. Misrule maybe can be interpreted a little differently. In fact, Father Paul Pearson has a fantastic little comment here in his commentary to Purgatorio that I'm going to read very briefly. He says, a story about G.K. Chesterton recounts a response that he was said to have written to a piece in the Times. In the original article, in response to the question, what is wrong with the world, blame was being apportioned to various injustices or historical events or social trends. And so Chesterton read that, and every different worldview seemed to provide its own perspective. The response attributed to Chesterton was notable for its brevity. The response was, "Dear Sir, I am." The question being, what is wrong with the world? Chesterton replied, "Dear Sir, I am." The lack of peace in our world is a product of individual human choice. This answer refuses to shift the blame away from ourselves, but it's also the only answer that can give us any hope of finding peace. If we can reform ourselves and revise our reactions, then peace is possible. Then it means that we have free will. Our Lord did not promise to bring war to an end, but he did tell us, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you," in John 14. The possibility of interior peace is part of his good news. We get here to the third movement of this very complex reasoning by Marco, where we are at verse 106, and Marco says, "For Rome, which made the world good, used to have two suns, and they made visible two paths, etc., etc." The stereotype in Dante's time was to think of the Pope as the sun and the emperor as the moon. Therefore, and this was obviously a simile that has been written and created by the papacy to aggrandize themselves. There was a church legislation called Unam Sanctam that was giving even more power, temporal power, to the popes, and that was actually issued by Boniface VIII, who is the archenemy of Dante in the Divine Comedy, and also was in reality. Dante is simply advocating for the separation between temporal powers to the emperor and religious powers or moral powers to the church, to the Pope. And in these times, this is not happening. It's not happening maybe in part for necessity, because the emperor is not doing his job, and therefore there is the abandonment sense and all that. But the biggest criticism goes to the church, that is doing something that doesn't have the authority, the right, and the reasons to do. In fact, we could say that ethics and politics were not two different things for Dante, were just one thing. It's only later on with thinkers and great philosophers like Machiavelli that these two things get separated, ethics and politics. Machiavelli thinks about, if we think about the Prince, it was all about politics, disconnected from ethics. Now, because if Dante and Marco remained only at the level of abstraction and principles, this would almost sound like a treatise or a pure essay like Il Convivio. It's important for Marco to mention names, to mention people, and this is a comment in general in Divine Comedy. It's wrong to see the fact that Dante uses names and last names as a petty way for Dante to indicate this or that. It's mostly his way to make his message as real and to really root his Divine Comedy in reality as much as possible, because it's his way to say, I'm not in the realm of abstraction, I am talking about reality. This is why on verse 121 he talks about the three old men. These three old men are Currado da Palazzo, Good Gerardo, Guido da Castel, all virtuous people, the few remaining good men and worthy men in Lombardia, in this region. And this idea of a small number of just men is a very biblical idea. Symbolically indicates the corruption of a community or a group of people or a city. And now I understand why Levi's sons were not allowed to share in legacies. The family of Levi, were in a priestly function, so they were not allowed to receive in heredity lands. So Dante now better understands why people who are in priestly functions should stay away from temporal power. And finally, in the last tercets, after an entire canto of complete blackness and darkness, there is a little bit of a glimpse of glimmering of light as they start exiting this cloud of thick smoke. Wow, what a complex canto, and forgive me if anything was not very clear of what I've been trying to highlight or describe, because it's one of the most dense of the entire Divine Comedy. But I hope this was informative and a little bit useful. Thank you very much. Thank you for watching.